Hi everyone, welcome to week 3 of Lit 215. So we're going to go over just a little bit of wrapping up the Lone Ranger and Tonto Fistfight in Heaven, and then I want you guys to make sure that you have a copy of our next book, Little Fires Everywhere, which will be starting in week 4. I'm really excited to get that going. So let's go ahead and get started. Hopefully this is a short and sweet video, and you guys can get back to your long weekends. Alrighty, so just a quick reminder, assignments this week. I did push back the due date for your culture paper to Tuesday at midnight. I figured since we really have a couple weeks between now and when you need to submit the proposal for your project, then there's really not that much of a hurry, and I wanted to give you guys the weekends because I didn't realize when I made our schedule that I had that due date fall on the holiday weekend, so enjoy a couple days on that. Then you've got a reading quiz and discussion board for this week. So those two are the same. Just give me about a week after the due date. So about a week from Tuesday is when I'll return your culture papers. Please don't email me before that week date is up. After that week, you are allowed to email me and be like, hey, where's my feedback? I'd like my grade. But I do have tons of writing students this semester and a lot of grading to keep up with. So please, please, please give me the week. Typically, I'll probably get them to you before the weekend, though, so I try to be as quick as I can. Just a reminder, I wanted to kind of go over our discussion board. I noticed that in the first 2 weeks, a lot of you guys were doing really great at the length and the depth of your posts, and then I noticed this past week, and I don't know if it was just because it was leading up to a long weekend and people are busy and just kind of getting into the semester, but I did notice that maybe the quality of our initial post dipped just a little bit. So I wanted to remind everyone of how I grade these and really what I'm looking for. So there are 5 categories that I grade your post on: prompt, length, examples, critical thinking, and responding to others. So the prompt and length are probably the easiest to miss points on. So are you answering specifically from our reading from this week? Is it obvious that you read and understood all of the reading? And then the length, are you writing at least 2 paragraphs? And by that, I mean more than just a couple sentences. Since our discussion board is really the meat of our course discussion, I really expect a lot of depth here. I kind of have high expectations of our discussion board. Then you're going to want to make sure you include examples from the reading. Are you specifically referring to one of Alexi's stories, for example? Try not to make kind of sweeping generalizations about the entire section. The more specific you can be, the higher quality of our discussion. All right, and then the last 2, critical thinking. Essentially, are you going past just, I liked it this week, or I didn't like it? That doesn't really tell me that you're able to think about and analyze what we're reading. So I want you to kind of move beyond that basic initial reaction. Pick out something specific, connect it to your own life, talk about something you read about outside of our course or something you're learning in another one. All of those connections, talking about the significance of these readings is what I'm looking for. And then finally, if you're responding to others, make sure that your responses are thoughtful and specific, okay? So in your response as well, I'm looking for more than, hey, I liked your post this week. Or, I agree, I thought the same. That's not really encouraging discussion further than just, oh, I responded because I have to. So I know if you're kind of rolling your eyes a little bit, I get it that sometimes it's just easier to kind of get this out of the way and move on. I get that we are all busy, but I really want to encourage you guys to dig in to these readings. I think that the more that we sit with them, the better our learning and sort of the mutual benefit of our course will be. All right, so for this week, we are finishing up the Lone Ranger and Tonto Fistfight in Heaven. There are 8 stories we're reading this week, so about the same amount as last week, and I picked out some themes that you might kind of think about as you read or you might discuss in our discussion board. The first of which, and you'll see this a lot in The Approximate Size of My Favorite Tumor, in Indian Education, in even Family Portrait, there's a lot of humor and sarcasm used as coping, as a way to kind of move past a lot of the difficult situations that the characters in these stories are dealing with, but then also as a way to criticize social systems. We see this a lot in Indian education, and I want you guys to notice specifically, how is Alexei trying to kind of poke fun at those systems, or how are his characters? How are they using jokes to deal with what they're experiencing? Another notice in Indian education is the idea of Indian residential schools. So Junior mentions that they went to a boarding school on the reservation, and I wanted to kind of give a little bit of context to this chapter specifically. So Indian reservation schools were established across the United States and also into Canada for Native Americans living on reservations. Oops, sorry, let me go back. Who didn't have, access to Native schools, but they were sort of a way to indoctrinate Native children. So a lot of these schools would come into reservations, require that any child living on the reservation getting government assistance require that they attend a residential school. But in doing so, there was a lot of push, especially at the beginning of the 19th century, to squash out any Native language, any Native religion, any culture that these students were bringing into the school, and sort of pigeonhole them into this essentially white culture. So the chapter on Indian education, I think, is a sort of view into the experience at one of these schools. There are still schools that exist and that run on the reservations that are Indian residential schools. I'm not going to generalize and say that all of them are bad, but I will say that a lot of them have had issues. And actually, if you follow any kind of major news outlet, a few months ago, there was a lot of stories about several Canadian residential schools where they found mass graves of young students, of particularly Indigenous children who had gone to these schools and essentially were never heard from again. And I know that sounds like something out of forensic files, but the reality is that real trauma and real harm happened at these schools, and that is something that all of us have to come to terms with. So I, as an instructor, as a student, as a teacher, the Indian education story really stuck out to me personally. So I'd like to see kind of what your guys' thoughts are. Other themes you might talk about: family and tribal relationships. This is something that's discussed in several stories, but how do those relationships develop? What are they based on? And how are they different from your own? Living off the reservation. We see this in the Lone Ranger and Tonto Fistfight in Heaven story, and also in Junior Palatkin's Wild West show. There's some discussion of how Junior leaves the reservation, decides to go to college, and there's a lot of discussion of his interactions with other people outside of Native culture, in his school, interacting with the police. So I'm interested to see your all's thoughts on that. I added here the ideas of assimilation and culture shock. When we think of culture shock, we think of maybe someone who has moved from their native country, say they were born in Japan and decided to move to the United States, or vice versa. When I left the US to live in Japan and work, I might experience what's called culture shock, which is where at first you're really excited to be in this new culture, and then as time goes on, you sort of deal with all of the ups and downs of living in a culture that's different from your own, all of the good and the bad. And I think we often talk about culture shock in the context of someone moving to a new country, but we don't really think of it in terms of someone moving from their community that they've grown up in to outside of it. So people can experience culture shock just from moving from a small town to a big city. You can experience culture shock just from leaving the reservation and being outside of it. So do you notice any of the signs of culture shock in Junior? And how can we address that culture shock for people that leave the reservation to sort of pursue a better situation for themselves, but then also want to uphold their, what is the word I'm looking for? Uphold their sort of responsibility to where they come from. Finally, This is a big question, but what does the future look like for Native Americans on and off the reservation? I noticed that in our discussion this last week, a lot of us were mentioning how sad these stories are and how much pain and trauma Native Americans have lived through. And that's incredibly true. But how do we honor their culture without writing this off and saying, oh, this is really sad. And I'm just going to feel really sad? That doesn't really encourage action. How can we use these stories to move forward, to talk about, to encourage discussion? So on that note, the overarching question I have for you this week is, why has this text become a significant text in Native American literature? Why is it important? And in your opinion, should it be? A lot of the canon that we consider good literature has been determined by other people, and so I'm curious to see what you all think. How do you feel about this as a text? And should it be considered literature? And if not, why not? If this book was inspiring to you and you're interested in some other Native American literature, I wanted to encourage you guys to check out a couple of books. They're There by Tommy Orange is incredible. It's a great text. A Day with Yaya, I have not read, but my sister got a copy of this for my niece and said it was a great sort of more sort of children-focused text. And then Give Me Some Truth is also incredible. So if you're like, man, I kind of want to pick up something else and see more of Native American literature, I would recommend these. There are also several you can find, kind of Googling. But if this is a type of literature that interests you, you might consider using this as your focus for our project, which we'll get to in a few weeks. And last but not least, make sure that you've got your copy of Little Fires Everywhere. This is by an author. Oh, I spelled her name wrong. I apologize. Her name is Celeste Ng. So if you were saying the word sing, just drop off the S and the I. That's how you pronounce her last name. And we are going to start her second novel, Little Fires Everywhere, next week in week 4. So keep your copy on hand, and we'll get started with that in a little bit. So good luck, guys, with this week, and I will see you soon.